Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. When I left the house this morning, I thought it was going to be a mess when we got here, but it cleared up about the time that we pulled in. But I know others are slowly making their way in. We're glad to see you here today. Glad you made it safely. Pray for everybody else as well. Before we begin, let's have a word of prayer, and then we will get started with our class. As I said, glad you're here, and let's go to God in prayer at this time. Father, we're so thankful for the day. We're thankful for the rain that we have and that we need. We're thankful for the time of study that we have and for the dry environment in which to do that. We pray for all of those who are engaged in study at this time. Bless this next hour as we worship in spirit and in truth. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we are here week number 4. Not the 4th week that we've done it. I've been out a little bit, but this is our 4th week of study. We are looking at that middle page right between the Old and New Testament. We're looking at the development of the world as it would be in the first century. When we get to that opening page of Matthew, my intent the whole time has been to, next time that you are reading through the New Testament, you don't just breeze over a name or a place or a feast, as we'll look at probably next class. You know what those things are. So it kind of adds to our understanding. Again, not that we need to know these things, but that they are helpful. Our theme text has been Galatians 4 and verse 4. When the fullness of time has come, or had come, God sent forth his Son. And so we're looking at that phrase that's in bold there. What does it mean, the fullness of time, when everything was ready and everything was prepared? As we go through this, hopefully you all have been and hopefully will continue to be impressed with all the things that happened, that took place in order to get us to the point where Jesus could be sent. And none of it, as far as we can tell, was miraculously took place or God was working directly. It's just simply after that time of Malachi for the next 400 years, things just happened. And these things fell into place so that Jesus could be sent. And so, as we have seen also, though, this is not something that God did not anticipate or that he did not know. This was certainly something not only that he had planned for, but he knew would happen. And so, as I've said a number of times, this is God did not leave himself without a witness. Every time that something happens, we can see either a prophecy for that or we can see mention about that. Daniel 2 being a very good outline perhaps of our class here. Daniel chapter 2 verses 36 through 45, that statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and Daniel told him, each of these is a kingdom. After you will rise another kingdom that's inferior to yours. And so we've outlined that, and we're working our way through there. We've here in the middle, that's where I don't want to say stuck, but that's where the majority of this takes place, is here in that middle section, and that's where we will continue today. But the head of fine gold, of course, was Babylon. We'll go over this at the end, but let's see how much you have retained up to this point. What would you say was something that Babylon contributed to the fullness of time? What is something that happened during the Babylonian captivity, during this time, that would say that's part of the fullness of time? What did they contribute? That's what I thought. Yes, the synagogue. Remember the Jews began to meet by rivers, and they began to read, and they didn't have the temple, so they had to kind of make do in captivity. And then once they came back from captivity, they brought that idea with them, so that when we get to the first century, there are Jews spread out all over the known world, and many of them have a synagogue there that Paul and many of the first century Christians would go, and that's where they would find their first converts, is in the synagogue there. And so that's something they contributed. We went on to the silver, the shoulder and arms of silver, and we talked about how that was Persia. What's something that Persia contributed? It was kind of small. I mentioned it at the end. I went over it again at the beginning of last class. But what did they contribute? We have the way of executing someone by either tying or nailing them to a tree, or as it would become when we get to the Romans, a cross. And so crucifixion kind of really begins to pick up speed under Persia. There are other things that they can contribute as well, but we'll mention those as we go. And these are some of the bigger ones. Now we get to the brass, belly and thighs of brass. As we said, we talked a great deal about that last class, and I hope hope you can view that again if you want to see that. But this is Greece, and we're going to continue talking about them today. So we have the belly and thighs of brass. And this is that large kingdom that comes kind of there in the middle, and there is a lot. If you couldn't think of anything for the first two, there's a lot that Greece contributes to the fullness of time. There's a lot that Greece contributes to the 21st century, and so it's certainly not something that is that's particular just to the first century. Daniel chapter 8, again, God did not leave himself without witness. Whenever we have something that, down through those 400 years, he anticipates that they're coming. He lets people know, I knew it ahead of time, it's coming. And Daniel 8 is certainly one of those places. We looked at Daniel 8 extensively the last class, but I did want to turn your attention to verses 20 and 21 today as we get into what we will be talking about. But Daniel had this vision as he was by the river Ulai, he says, or the canal that's there. And he saw a large ram that had two horns, and then he saw this, that nothing could stand against it. And then he sees this he-goat that comes from the west and is coming east, and it completely destroys this ram. And he describes them in symbolic terms, one horn being larger than the other. We've talked about that. But then in verses 20 and 21, he describes for us or interprets what those images are. He said that ram is the kings of Media and Persia, and then this rough he-goat that destroys the ram is Greece, the kingdom of Greece, and that one single horn, you'll remember that the goat had a horn coming out between its eyes, that is the first king. And so we talked about Greece, and in particular Alexander the Great, who is that king. Back in verse 8 of Daniel chapter 8, the part we looked at primarily last time is this first part. We're going to start there today, looking at what I continue to be this part right here. The he-goat waxed very great, and then we're going to look at the second part, or towards the end of our class today. So let's continue here with the waxing very great. It would be an understatement to say that Greek culture had an impact on this part of the world, particularly Judea and many other parts that we're familiar with the first century during this time period. Greek culture was overwhelming in its popularity. I was talking with Kenny after last class, and we were looking at that map. I'll show you the map here in a moment of these really large areas and these different empires or people groups that are there, and sometimes the ones that are smaller seem to get the better of the bigger ones. How does the Persian Empire that's so large, how does it lose all this ground to this small Greek-speaking people over here in the West? And he used a good word. He asked, does it have to do with organization? Absolutely. That these groups that come on afterwards are very organized in how they spread not only their military authority, as we saw with Philip of Macedonia, but also their culture itself. Greek culture was something that was incredibly popular. People would cling to it. People liked this. It wasn't new, but it was new to them. The language that the Greeks spoke, the gods, but not only that, the culture and their entertainment and their philosophy, it was something that people really were drawn to. And so more than the Babylonians or the Persians, the Greeks had this added benefit of being something that people were drawn to. It's very similar to the way American culture is spread throughout the world. There are two kinds of power if you study political science. One is hard power, and that's we put more money in our military than you. That's hard power. You understand, bombs and everything else. But there's another called soft power, and it's the culture that people just being near you are influenced by you. One of the most widely understood word in the entire world is Coca-Cola. Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, a number of other famous celebrities are known the world over. That's not because we have more guns than people. It's just because people are drawn to American culture. Similar to that in the Greek-speaking world. I keep saying Greek. They would call themselves Hellenists. The Hellenism is the spread of this Greek culture. It does mean one who uses the Greek language, and that's what Greeks call themselves, is the Hellenists. But it came to mean anything having to do with the language, but also their culture, their ideas, and their influence that they had. This is a couple of older slides, but just to get ourselves oriented here. The way that it was spread, of course, was Alexander's military. But once he had conquered a region, he was very good about, and this is the word that we used, organizing. these places. He would found new cities, and he wouldn't just take over a new city and say, okay, I'm in charge. He would build new ones in addition to that would model Greek culture for the people around them. And so while you in Jerusalem might be well rooted in your ancient customs, as they might think of them, over here we've got a city called Alexandria. He built 70 and named them after himself. And it's been built from the ground up, and it is basically what we want the rest of the world to look like. And so they would build these new cities that would you could go there and see all the brand new Greek temples and their statues, but also be entertained in their theaters and their other places of culture and that sort of thing. So a lot of ways to spread that culture. And so that kept people close to it. And so they were less likely to rebel because they wanted to be close to that. They wanted to be like the Greeks, and later the Romans would do the same thing. People wanted to be like the Romans, even if they didn't quite like the idea of paying taxes to their leaders. But then there was also this notion of suppression or ridicule for local customs. Particularly with the Jews, it was the ridicule of things like circumcision and dietary laws. The Greeks would, they would eat anything, basically. And to say that the Jews were abstaining from pork and from other kinds of unclean things, that was not only something that was foreign to the Greeks, they looked down on it. And so you have this kind of persecution that we might think of today, where people in the dominant culture look down on what you're doing. And so they're not really persecuting in that they're throwing people in prison, but they're saying, oh, you believe that backward stuff, you believe that whatever. So it's, it kind of reminds me of what we might have today as far as culture is concerned. Questions, comments as we go through here?
We see the power of minority groups in this country today.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the power that's, talk more about that. What do you mean by that, the power of minority groups?
Well, some of these, the LGBT movement, for instance, small group, look what they're able to do with their organization.
Oh, I see. Yeah, smaller groups throughout history certainly get a power of their own, especially when absorbed and accepted by more people. That's right. Very good. The Hellenism, again, it didn't just dominate because of their military. The Persians came through and they had the stronger army, therefore they dominated. The Greeks came through and certainly had a stronger military, as we noticed last time, but they left behind them things that people wanted to cling to. That's why the Persians didn't last nearly as long as the Greeks do. I know we're going to talk about the Roman Republic and eventually the Roman Empire, but they just basically took Greek culture and they just scratched off the name and wrote their name above it, is basically what they did. And so this speaks to not only what the Greeks were able to accomplish in a secular way, but it also helps us determine or it helps us to see what the first century was like in the New Testament. So when we get to, especially the book of Acts, and we get Paul going to these places, and I know he went to Athens, but he goes to a lot of other places that had been affected by this Greek culture for upwards of 300 years in certain places. And so in cities, especially these newly built cities, you would have these places there that would just exude this Greek culture. Education, you could go to the gymnasiums and read or hear recited Greek literature and a number of other things that were there. The theaters and the places of entertainment were everywhere. And it made you want to stay close by. If we rebel and destroy all this beautiful stuff and go back to the way that we were, well, that's just, we're stepping down from culture. We're going to be like the barbarians again. And so that was a way that they kind of, they pulled people towards them instead of forcing them to be part of the empire there. Religion, of course, polytheism, very ubiquitous in these times. It was everywhere. As with the Romans, the Greeks would also take the gods of whatever people group they encountered, scratch the name off and write a different name above it, and then add it to their list of all their gods that they had. And so the polytheism, the mythology, worshiping of kings. Alexander was not just Alexander the Great. He was thought of as maybe one step down from a god. And so he was worshipped, but also the other kings that would come along after that. We're going to talk about some of them next time. But all of this can be wrapped up in a phrase called the polis structure, or polis there meaning city. But it became one of the ways that the Greeks, I don't want to use the word enforced, but they were kind of enforcing their ways on other people. Not by force, but by just simply by their influence. And so this is a picture, this is obviously a artistic drawing here of what the quintessential Greek city at the time would be. And I wanted to point out a few things because it's going to be important for the New Testament when we get there. But all of these polis structure, you'll notice the straight streets that are there. So you kind of had that grid pattern that's there. That's not something that happens naturally. If you've ever been to older cities in this country like Boston, they do not have grid-like streets. They don't just happen like that naturally. They have to be planned. New York City was planned with that grid in line. That's a Roman and even earlier than that a Greek idea. So you see those streets that are there. But usually somewhere in the city, it's almost always in the middle for obvious reasons, is something called the agora. This is an open area where you kind of have the city center. And this is where a lot of things would happen, but this is where the culture would be exhibited. This would be perhaps a market, but it could also be places for philosophers to meet and have their classes, and they could philosophize for everybody to hear. And so this is kind of like the place where Greek culture was preached. And this is where they wanted that to happen. Of course, somewhere in the city as well, there's going to be a theater where the culture could be shown through entertainment. So they would, and if you wanted to be part of that group that was being entertained, what language did you need to know? Well, you needed to learn Greek. And so that was a way for them, again, to combine people. Whereas Babylon would take people from one part of the empire, move them over here, and force them to learn a language, the Greeks just said, hey, we're in charge, and we're going to be over here talking about you. And if you want to know what we're saying, well, then you need to learn our language. Greek's a hard language to learn. It's difficult, but it became dominant in part because of things like this, the theater. And of course, somewhere in the city, usually at the highest point, is something called the Acropolis. And this is where the temple would be. This is where the place of worship would be that was also exhibiting Greek culture in its religion. A couple years ago when we first started here, we looked at the 1 Corinthians, and one of the things we did at the beginning was notice that mountain that was behind the city, and that's where their major deities were worshipped, was up there on top of that hill, the Mount Corinth that was there behind them. And so somewhere you have this place called the Acropolis. You've seen pictures, at least, of this city in real life, and that's because it is the Greek city. Some of those places perhaps that you've seen is Athens, obviously. This is what they're going to model all of their cities after. That part there that's the highest point, that's the Acropolis. That's where the Parthenon is and all the other things. But obviously there's going to be those theaters and other parts of Greek culture. When you read Acts 17, when Paul goes to Athens and he goes there to Mars Hill and he's looking at all of those gods, most of these things would have been around him as well. He could have seen these things. This Greek culture with the theater and the language and all the other things are there behind him. So don't just read the Acts 17 and just think there's a couple of stones that he's looking at. All of this was just constantly bombarding people to be like us, be like the culture around us. Which isn't always bad, but it can be, depending on what it is that people are wanting to do. Athens is not the only city, however, that's like this. Here's a picture of Judea. This is Jerusalem down there, just to orient and give yourselves an idea of where it is. As we're going to see in our next class, the people of Judea in particular really pushed against this Greek culture for obvious reasons. They really didn't want to have it, and they did a lot of things that other places didn't do. Whereas many were accepting, they distanced themselves or tried to. But it doesn't mean it wasn't close by, because up here in the northern part of this picture is a place called Caesarea. There were several places in this place called Caesarea. When Jesus asked his disciples, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" He was in Caesarea Philippi. That's not on this map. It's actually above the top of this page. Here, this one is called Caesarea Maritima, and it wasn't built by the Greeks. You see the word Caesar there. It was built by the Romans, or their Roman, the people that accepted Rome as their leaders. But this is Caesarea Maritima, but it was built after this Greek this Greek idea of what a city should look like. And so while Jerusalem was not destroyed and rebuilt in the Greek fashion, they would have been very familiar with this Greek culture. We'll talk more about this city because the guy who built it and some of the things that happened in this city that you read of in the New Testament, very interesting. But I wanted to bring it out right now just to show this. The coastline, if you can see it here on this map, the coastline of the eastern Mediterranean, Israel, Syria, all of that, it is really smooth. There are almost no natural harbors. The only that you could consider to be a natural harbor is Joppa. That's really the only place where you could dock a ship anywhere close to the shore to unload stuff. And so you have very few that's there. Well, the Romans, as they do, they come along and say, that's no problem. We're just going to build a harbor out into the sea. And so what you see there at the top is an unnatural harbor that's built by the Romans and quite ingenious. We don't give the ancients enough credit for how intelligent they really were. But besides that, we'll look at that later because that is quite interesting. But I want you to notice what was in the middle of Caesarea Maritima, here in what we would call the Holy Land, or Israel, Judea, is this temple. This one at the time is the temple of Augustus. That would be the first Roman emperor. And so that's where they would worship the king of the Roman Empire. That was there. We have the hippodrome. That's not the water. The hippodrome is actually that. It's not drawn very well here because that's not what it looked like. But it's on the right side. Anybody know what the word hippo means in Greek? A horse. Yeah, this is where they raced horses. We think of hippo as, the hippopotamus. When the Greeks and eventually the Romans went to Egypt, they saw these really large animals that were in the river. And the only large animal they could think of was a horse. So they called it a river horse, a hippopotamus. And that's where we get the word for that. So this is where they had the horse racing. Again, sport. Was part of the Greek culture. And so you could go to Caesarea and you could watch a horse race or a chariot race or whatever it is that they were doing there. There's the forum, the agora that I had there in the middle. That's where the center of the culture was. You could go there and talk to people, and that's just where the public forum was. And so that's where that was. And of course, right outside the city is going to be your amphitheater. That's where it was. So think of it like a movie theater, or we have the internet today that just culture is inundating on us and flooding into our eyes and our minds, and that's what the Greeks did. Not that they were trying to necessarily going out of their way to try to do that. They were very proud of their culture, and they just wanted everybody to be like them, which is why Alexander the Great is sometimes called the apostle of Hellenism, because he was preaching and teaching how to be Greek to everybody that he conquered, that he didn't kill. But this would be that functioning light on a hill that couldn't be hidden. And so the Jews of the first century, and again, we'll get into some more stuff later, really were pressing against the push or the oncoming flood of this Greek culture. But most people just let it happen. And so that was something that they had to endure. One more of these Greek kind of Greek planned cities. This is Damascus. Damascus is, as far as I can tell, the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. Been around for thousands of years. But whenever an earthquake would destroy a portion of it, or it would need to be rebuilt, the dominant culture at the time would decide how to rebuild it. And so Damascus during the first century is very much a Greek-themed or Greek-inspired city. In fact, you see, hopefully you can see from the diagram here, the grid pattern of most of the streets. And right there in the center, going from one gate on the west all the way to another gate on the east, is the street called Straight Street. Now, the ancients did not name their streets like we do. They didn't really think a road needed a name. They would just either, you knew where the street was, so someone could tell you about the location, or like this, they kind of named it what it was. It was the first one that they built that was straight, and so that's what they called it, Straight Street. Acts chapter 9, verse 11, Jesus appeared to Ananias and told him, I need you to go in Damascus there to a street called Straight, and I need you to look for this person, Saul, who is praying. And so the reason that he could tell him where to go in the city and why it was called that is because originally the Greek idea of what a city was to look like had been folded into Damascus, and they could know where he was. Questions, comments, talk about those cities that are there. Also, the dominant part of Hellenism, or this Greek culture, is philosophy, natural laws and reason, using your mind. Again, I don't need religion. I don't need anything like that to tell me what I see or what's true in the world. I can use other senses. I can use other experiences to determine what's right and wrong. This is not a new idea in our culture today. This was something that the Greeks had been philosophizing about for centuries, even before this. So while some of the stuff on this list we would look at and say, it's no big deal, and being entertained and building a city with straight streets, no big deal. But some of these things that was part of the culture would seep into the people, and it changed them in certain ways for the worse. And so this was one of the things that the Jews at the time were pushing out against. They wanted to be separate. They wanted to be different, and because that's what they that God had commanded them to be, and they didn't want to be like everybody else. It's interesting when you look at before the Babylonian captivity, the Jews wanted to be like everybody around them. Make us a king like the nations round about us. We want to have all these gods like the nations around us. But because of the Babylonian captivity, they came back different than ever. They wanted to be completely separate, basically, to the point where they didn't even want to speak the same language that the Greeks and others were speaking. So they were trying to be separate, but many of them were struggling, as we'll see in our coming classes. But the most important contribution that the Hellenists, that the Greeks made to the New Testament, and we cannot overstate how important this is the language. I've already mentioned it and kind of how they learned it and why people wanted to learn it. It wasn't something that was forced upon people. It's very similar to the way English has become the dominant language in the world today, but the Greek language. This map and the colors, I don't know why you choose blue to indicate something when you have the ocean right there next to it, but the darker blue is where the Greek language was during the time of Alexander. So just, a little bit, the coasts and Greece, that's it. It didn't even get up to where Alexander was from. He had to adopt it himself. The lighter blue is where it gets a couple of hundred years after Alexander. You see how it's kind of creeping down the coast there on the far right side towards what would be Jerusalem. And so just in the time, a century or so after Alexander's death, the people are starting to speak it not only as kind of a second or third language, but this is their first language. And in our day where, you could go almost anywhere in the world and find someone that understands English, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around, in these days, you go to the next city and they're speaking a language that you don't know. And so there were so many languages. To have one language that most people understood is really, really impressive and rare in ancient history. So by the time we get to the first century, most people, especially where Paul went in his early missionary journeys, they all spoke the same language, either as their second language or in some cases it was the one they learned from a child. And so wherever Alexander went or wherever Greek culture went, the language went as well, because you couldn't read their plays, you couldn't understand their plays in the theater, you couldn't understand their philosophy if you didn't know the language. And so people would adopt it, and then the early church was able to go, even without the benefit of miraculous gifts, what they certainly had, and was able to preach and teach the people there using the language that people already knew. And so even without miraculous gifts, it would be able to spread quite far. But when you add the other languages on there, as you saw in Acts chapter 2, that got people's attention because they were speaking these other languages as well. And so the language, I'll go back to that here in just a moment, but the ways, the methods of doing that, of course, is these new cities that would model kind of what Greek culture was. Greek-friendly local leaders. When you get to the first century and you read of people like Herod, several Herods that are there, you get to Pilate and others. These are not Greek, they're Romans, but you have that same kind of structure that's been in place for 200, 250 years of, yes, we have a king, but he is beholden to another guy who's way over in Rome or Athens or wherever the emperor was located. And so these Greek-friendly leaders would certainly want to impress the people that he was leading for. So he would want to influence others. Herod was really trying to put Roman and Greek culture into the city of Jerusalem. A building would fall down and he'd rebuild it in the Greek or Roman fashion. He really was trying to impress the Romans for these things. And so when I put someone in charge who is friendly to me, that helps me spread Greek culture. Economic incentives. If you will tear down your market and rebuild it in the agora Greek style, we'll give you a tax break. And so again, everything was beneficial to become more Greek. And that was certainly a temptation for the people. And of course, as I've mentioned, the suppression, ridicule of traditional customs certainly helped to influence people, kind of like peer pressure, trying to get them to do that. We'll talk more about this next time because they really pushed against it. But there were many groups, especially in Judea, Israel, that we would call it, that their response to it was not what others were. There were other cultures that said, cool, you're the guys in charge, we'll let you take over and we'll become Greek. That's fine. But in Jerusalem and the area surrounding that was not what they wanted. The ruling elites, they embraced Hellenism. The Sadducees, the Herodians that you read of in the New Testament, they were the ruling elites. We often think of the Pharisees and Sadducees as being, together enemies of Jesus, and they were. But before Jesus, they were enemies of themselves. The Pharisees were the ultra-conservative. They wanted to maintain their traditional ways, but also go even further. And the Sadducees were the far left, the liberal group that wanted to be like the other people. Whatever the Greeks did, they wanted to be like them. And they were the ones that were in charge, the Sadducees. So they were the ruling elites, and they embraced it. However, many of the Jews, they didn't have a middle class, but middle and lower class, we would think of them, they resisted. This is not what we have been taught. This is not what our scriptures say. And so they are resisting. And there were several areas of conflict that we'll see later, circumcision being one. That was weird, for obvious reasons to the Greeks. The Sabbath and dietary laws, these were unheard of. You're not going to eat pork? What are you kidding me? And so that was something that the ruling elites and the Greeks would try to suppress. And then, of course, the religious exclusivity, being we're only going to worship this one God. That was something that the Greeks didn't like. When we get to the New Testament, and even after the New Testament, we often think of the Roman persecution as being this, really, this really impressively oppressive persecution. Are you a Christian? Yes, we're going to put you to death. That wasn't really what the persecution was about. The Romans didn't care that you worshiped other gods. In fact, they wanted to take your God and put him in with all of theirs. What they didn't like was that you only worshiped one God. Because, and you got to put yourself in the mind of a Roman here, if there are 100 gods that are controlling the world, we need to offer sacrifices to all 100 of them. Because if we leave one out, that one's going to get upset and cause some kind of problem. What did Paul see in Acts 17? What was that altar to? The unknown God. A better word would be the forgotten God. Maybe we've forgotten that there's 101, not just 100. And so they had one to catch all the ones that they forgot. And Paul turned a phrase and told them about the true God. But the Christians, and before them the Jews, were exclusively worshiping in their minds, in the Greek mind, only one of the 100. And so the reason they persecuted the Jews and the reason they persecuted the Christians later is because they weren't being good team players. You're only worshiping one God, and we just really want you to worship the rest of them as well so that society will continue. Because if you forget a God, there's going to be an earthquake, there's going to be a flood, there's going to be a fire. And so you're not being a good team player. And so if you will worship the rest of them, you can go on living the way that you want to. The Jews rejected that. The Christians later would reject that as well. And so that was the main thrust behind the Roman persecution. Other ideologies as well, but that was definitely one of them. And so this was their response. They wanted to be exclusive or isolated from Greek culture, and that was something that they would attempt to do. It wasn't going to go well for them for a time, as we'll see next time. Anything else there? That's the first half of Daniel 8, verse 8. I just want to impress upon you that culture was everywhere, and that was something they had. So we've got this first part where the goat waxed very great. This goat was enormous. As we've seen, the culture was everywhere. But then it says, but when that horn was strong, it was broken. And now we saw from verses 20 and 21 that the horn is the first king of Greece, so that's Alexander the Great. When he was strong, the horn was broken. And then from that place where there was one horn, there came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven, or we might say the 4 corners of the earth. So let's notice that part for the rest of our time that we have here. Here's the picture of what at the time would be the Greek empires. The largest known at the time, it goes from Egypt in the bottom left, Greece is in the top right, goes all the way through Iraq, Iran, Pakistan today, and all the way to the border with India. And so it is just a massive plot of land that the Greeks are trying to, Hellenize and preach the good things about Greek culture too during that time. But that's only at his death. Alexander goes all that way and then dies at the age of 32. And then we have something called the diadochi, which is a word that means succession or receive. Who's going to be in charge after Alexander's death? Suddenly, he dies in 323. Some people say he got sick, malaria, something like that. Others say he was poisoned and dies at the age of 32. He had a young son, but that son doesn't make it until about the age of 14 when he dies. And so really, he had no strong heir. And so if you die without an heir, the guys who were your assistants, your generals, they're going to want to take their place. They're going to think they're the strongest. And so after his death, we enter into a period of civil wars. Or actually like 3 or 4. But these generals would fight each other. So the army that was fighting to spread Greek culture suddenly turns on each other. And they want their leader to be the next emperor to take the place of Alexander. No one's going to be able to take his place, obviously. And so what happens is they begin to fight, and it eventually ends up to, as Daniel said, there were 4. There were 4 that kind of became the dominant ones in their region. And so while it's one Greek empire, eventually it becomes 4 separate ones that all speak Greek and have Greek culture involved. So they're related, they're similar, but they are 4 distinct groups. Cassander, I'll show you these on a map. Cassander, Antigonus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. The last 2 are the only ones we'll be concerned about. But that red that we saw just a moment ago is now divided into 4. And I know that 1 or 2 are very much larger than the others. But when you go towards the left, the west, over in Greece, that reddish color where Cassander is now ruling, that's home. That's Greece, that's Athens, that's Pelis, the capital as well. That orange area is where the people following Antigonus would be located. You also see this as Lysimachus is another general who was in charge there. And then the 2 that we're going to be concerned with, the lighter green and the darker green. The lighter green is going to become the Seleucus or the Seleucid Empire, and the Greeks are the Ptolemies. That PT is the Greek word there. They say the P, we don't. That's just part of our language there. So we have the Ptolemies or the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucids. And you'll see right where they border is modern-day Israel, Judea, Jerusalem. One of the problems with the people of Israel throughout their history has been their location. Not a good location. They've been in between these major empires that as they're fighting each other, they kind of suffer collateral damage. And so that's going to happen for the next, this is 320, but it's going to be for the next 300 years. These 2 groups and eventually Rome are all going to be fighting each other right in their backyard. And so it's not that the Jews were this mighty people. They just happened to live in the place where there was lots of tension there. So these empires continue to fight each other, but once they kind of settle down, then they start focusing again on consolidating power in their area and spreading Greek culture. Had a negative and also positive means of consequences for the people that are there. This is Egypt, and we have it's called eventually be called the Ptolemaic Empire. And until the Romans came, they were the ones in charge. And while you probably don't know or have heard of any of the other Ptolemies that were ruling there, I'm sure you've heard of this lady right here. This is Cleopatra. She was Cleopatra the third or fourth. And, when we think of her, she's Egyptian. She's Julius Caesar comes and is enthralled with her. And, I'm sure you've seen movies or heard stories about. She wasn't Egyptian. She was a Greek. Just because her family had taken over after Alexander the Great, and she was the last in line of all of those leaders that are there. But, and this is an interesting turn, whereas Greek culture everywhere else pulled people to them, in Egypt, Egyptian culture pulled the Greeks to them. They wanted to be like the Egyptians, and so they put makeup on to make themselves look like them. They wore the Egyptian headdresses and put on the clothes, and other than speaking Greek, they looked Egyptian. It was kind of exotic to them, kind of, I guess, the way that it seems to us today. But Cleopatra, we'll talk about her line. She was not an Egyptian, she was Greek, the same way that Alexander was, or others that were spreading that Greek culture that's there. But I wanted to mention this right at the end as we get to the end, and we'll have to pick up here next time. But like many people in the Greek Empire, the Jews in Egypt began to abandon their native language and adopt Greek culture. And so they stopped speaking Hebrew, or Aramaic is the term, is what they spoke in Israel at the time. And they started to adopt Greek. And as a result, they lost the ability to read the Old Testament. But they needed a translation. And they got one because of the Greeks living in Egypt. Something called the Septuagint. Sometime during this time period of the Ptolemies, about 250, the Ptolemaic kings at the time commissioned the translation of every book they could find. We want to have every book ever written, and we want to translate it into Greek. And so the Hebrew Scripture was one of the many books that they had, and so they translated it into Greek. And this was the Septuagint, and it was a Greek translation of the Old Testament, beginning with the Torah, the first 5 books, but it eventually would become the entire Old Testament. According to legend, stories that they tell, the king at the time had 70 people translate the Old Testament from Hebrew or Aramaic into Greek. And all 70 of them had memorized it, and they wrote it down by memory, and then when they compared it, all 70 were exactly correct in Greek. That's legend. That's the story that's told. But that number, 70, that's where we get this word Septuagint. That's the Greek or anglicized version of the Greek word for 70. And so the translation of the 70 is what it's called, and it becomes the dominant version that people used in the first century. When Paul goes and he's spreading the gospel and he's writing out in Greek, when he is quoting from the Old Testament, more than likely he's using the Septuagint, and this is where that came from. You'll also see it written as LXX. If you remember your Roman numeral days, that's the number 70 in Roman numerals. So the Septuagint, the translation of the 70, it's the Greek version of the Old Testament. It's the one that's used throughout, and though Aramaic was the language spoken in Judea, Greek would have been the second language that people use. And I'm not going to go any further with that. But any questions very quickly, as that's our bell. I'll talk more about that. I'll actually show you some examples of Jesus quoting from either the Septuagint or another version. We'll get into that and talk about versions, that sort of thing. So that'll be next week. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate you being here today.